fire will be warm inside.
And the ale warmer still. Come on then.
Take a moment and notice your evening. Not the dramatic parts, just the ordinary ones. There is probably a screen nearby, maybe more than one. A phone resting on your chest, warming slightly as it updates itself without asking. A half-finished episode paused at a moment chosen by an algorithm that knows your habits better than most people do. A voice in your headphones, familiar, calm, explaining something you didn't plan to learn tonight, but accepted anyway because silence felt unnecessary. This is what evening looks like now. Soft, adjustable, endlessly negotiable. You can pause it, mute it, rewind it, replace it with something else without standing up. Now gently remove all of that, not dramatically, not all at once. Just imagine it quietly failing. The screen goes dark. The signal never arrives. There is no power, not because of a storm or an emergency, but because it simply does not exist yet. No electricity, no internet, no glowing rectangle to reassure you that time is passing in a controlled, productive way. There is no next episode. There is no background noise designed to feel intentional. There is only night, not the comfortable darkness of a modern bedroom, softened by street lights and standby LEDs. This darkness is thicker, heavier. It presses inward rather than receding politely. Somewhere nearby, gas lamps hiss and flicker, never fully steady, never fully reliable. Their light does not fill space, it stains it. Corners remain corners. Shadows stay sharp. The air smells faintly of coal smoke, damp stone, warm bodies, and something sour that no one bothers to name anymore. Your room, if it can be called a room, is not silent. Walls are thin. Floors complain. Someone coughs nearby. Someone laughs too loudly and then stops, suddenly aware of how sound travels at night. This is not a retreat from the world. This is the world, still very much awake. Welcome to Victorian England. And here's the part that tends to surprise modern minds. They were not bored, not in the way we imagine boredom now, as a lack of stimulation, a failure of content delivery, a gap that must be filled immediately, or else something has gone wrong. Their nights were not empty. They were crowded with voices, with noise, with people finding ways, sometimes clumsy, sometimes loud, sometimes ridiculous, to remind themselves that they were still present, still awake, still human after a day designed to reduce them to motion. We tend to picture the Victorian era as stiff and restrained, all posture and propriety, straight backs, serious faces, a civilization holding its breath for an entire century. This image survives because it photographs well, but lived history rarely does. In reality, Victorian evenings were messy. They were uneven. They were often uncomfortable and occasionally chaotic. And most importantly, they were shared. There was no private bubble of entertainment that followed you home. No personalized feed adjusting itself to your mood. If you wanted amusement, you had to go where other people were already being inconvenient. Entertainment did not arrive. You walked toward it. Sometimes several streets. Sometimes through smoke. Sometimes past things you preferred not to think about. And when you arrived, it did not ask whether you were ready. It was loud. It smelled strange. It involved other people's opinions, which, in retrospect, may explain a great deal. Imagine finishing a long day, not metaphorically long, but physically exhausting. Hours spent lifting, carrying, repeating the same motion until your body stops distinguishing between effort and existence. You return not to privacy, but to proximity. Rooms divided by thin boards, lives stacked vertically, every sound belonging to someone else as much as to you. And then, despite all of that, the evening begins. Not because you are rested, not because you feel inspired, but because the alternative, sitting alone with your own thoughts in the dark, is somehow worse. So you go out, not to relax, to endure differently. Victorian evenings were not designed to soothe, they were designed to interrupt the rhythm of labor, interrupt the feeling of being replaceable, interrupt the quiet realization that tomorrow would look exactly like today. In a world without recorded entertainment, amusement had to be generated in real time by real bodies with real voices. And real voices are rarely perfect. They sing slightly off key. They forget lines. They argue about rules. They repeat jokes that weren't very good the first time. But they are there, which mattered more than quality. From a modern perspective, this all sounds exhausting. Why not just rest? Why not enjoy silence? Because silence in that world was not neutral. Silence meant isolation. It meant you were alone with the arithmetic of your life wages, hours, rent, tomorrow. Noise, by contrast, meant company. It meant witnesses. Victorian entertainment was not about escape in the modern sense. It did not promise relief from reality. Reality was far too present for that. Instead, it offered transformation. The same room could become something else for a few hours. The same people could rearrange themselves into a crowd. The same voices repeated together could feel like momentum. And yes, it was often crude, sometimes stupid, occasionally deeply unfair. But it was active. You did not watch it happen. You were inside it. Which brings us back to the present moment. You, lying down, comfortable, warm, your evening curated so carefully that nothing unexpected is allowed to intrude unless you permit it. You are safer, healthier, almost certainly better rested. And yet, the need that brought you here, listening to a voice instead of sitting in silence, has not changed at all. The technology did, the furniture did, the lighting improved dramatically, but the desire to end the day feeling connected, distracted, slightly altered, that remained intact. Victorian people did not have electricity, but they had something else. They had each other. In all the inconvenient, noisy, imperfect ways that required effort rather than a subscription. And tonight we're going to walk through those evenings. Not the polite ones, not the carefully preserved ones, the ones where people laughed too loudly, stayed out too late, spent money they shouldn't have, and felt briefly dangerously like more than what the day allowed them to be. Get comfortable, not because the story is gentle, but because it moves slowly, and because once the night begins, in Victorian England, it does not ask whether you are ready. It simply opens the door. When entertainment wasn't a luxury, but a requirement. We tend to imagine Victorian people as permanently serious, as if they were born already dressed for a formal portrait, backs straight, expressions composed, waiting patiently for history to finish with them. This image is convenient, it fits textbooks, it behaves well in museums, but it has very little to do with how most Victorians actually lived. Paintings show us polished surfaces. Life, on the other hand, happened in cramped rooms with uneven floors, low ceilings, and far too many bodies sharing far too little space. And for the vast majority of people, especially those who labored for wages rather than inherited income, entertainment was not something added to life when everything else was taken care of. It was something inserted into life precisely because nothing else was. A Victorian working day did not gently taper off. It ended abruptly, not when the body felt finished, but when the schedule declared it acceptable to stop. 12 hours was normal. 14 hours was not remarkable. The work was physical, repetitive, and largely indifferent to individual endurance. By the time evening arrived, muscles did not relax so much as surrender. Hands remained stiff. Shoulders ached in a way that sleep alone could not fix. And yet, rest was not guaranteed, because rest required space, quiet, and privacy, three things that were in chronically short supply. Beds were shared, rooms were shared, air was shared, even exhaustion was communal. This is the part that modern comfort tends to erase from memory. When we imagine fatigue today, we imagine the kind that can be solved by lying down in a clean, quiet room, perhaps with something playing softly in the background. Victorian fatigue was different. It followed you home and then stayed awake with you. Which is why the idea of simply going to bed early rarely appealed to anyone who had the option not to. Silence in that context was not restful. It was accusatory. Silence left space for counting hours worked, money earned, money owed, days until the next wage. Silence invited the mind to review its own limitations in careful detail. Noise, by contrast, interrupted that process. Entertainment for the working class was not about indulgence. It was about displacement, shifting attention just far enough away from the arithmetic of survival to make the next day possible. And this is where the modern misunderstanding begins. From a distance, Victorian amusements look crude. Simple games, loud songs, repetitive jokes, activities that appear frankly inadequate for people who had access to nothing better. But this judgment assumes that entertainment exists to impress. For Victorian workers, entertainment existed to absorb. It absorbed energy that would otherwise turn inward. It absorbed frustration that had nowhere safe to go. It absorbed identity for a few hours, allowing a person to be something other than their job title, their wage bracket, or their landlord's problem. Imagine a man who spends the entire day lifting crates, following instructions that do not change, under supervision that rarely improves, knowing that no matter how well he performs, tomorrow will require the same effort for the same reward. When evening arrives, what he needs is not refinement. He needs release. Release did not arrive politely. It arrived loudly, unevenly, and often with questionable musical accuracy. Victorian entertainment was participatory because it had to be. There was no audience in the modern sense. There were only people who were present and people who were not. If you wanted amusement, you contributed to it, even if your contribution was limited to shouting encouragement, singing the wrong words at the wrong time, or laughing harder than the joke deserved simply because laughing felt better than not. This is where the stereotype of Victorian restraint collapses entirely. The same people who appeared solemn in daylight photographs were capable of extraordinary noise once evening loosened its grip, not because they had changed personalities, but because the context had changed. The daytime world required compliance. The evening allowed expression. Not freedom exactly. Freedom would have been too much to hope for, but expression within limits that felt temporarily negotiable. Entertainment provided a narrow corridor through which emotion could move without causing immediate damage. A person could shout at a game rather than at an employer. They could sing about wealth they did not possess. Instead of discussing wages they could not raise, they could laugh at exaggerated authority figures rather than confronting real ones. This was not accidental. Victorian amusements often revolved around competition, performance, and shared attention because these were the only arenas where ordinary people could experience agency without consequences that followed them home. Winning a small game mattered not because the prize was significant, but because winning itself was rare. Losing was familiar. Winning, even briefly, disrupted expectation. And yes, this often involved spending money that probably should have gone elsewhere. From a modern budgeting perspective, Victorian leisure choices appear irresponsible. Why spend precious coins on drink, games, or entry fees when rent was looming and food was never guaranteed? But this assumes that survival is purely physical. Mental endurance is harder to quantify and easier to underestimate. A person who never experiences interruption eventually becomes mechanical. Victorian society was already excellent at turning people into functions. Entertainment was one of the few counterweights available. There is a quiet irony here. The very people least able to afford leisure were the ones most dependent on it. For the upper classes, entertainment was optional. For the middle classes, it was scheduled. For the working classes, it was essential, not because it made life easier, but because it made life bearable. And it is worth noting that this entertainment was not particularly comfortable. Venues were crowded, air was stale, seats were hard or non-existent. Voices overlapped constantly. From a modern standpoint, it sounds unpleasant. But discomfort was already the baseline. What mattered was change. A different kind of discomfort felt like relief. There is also something quietly unsettling about how little this has changed. We flatter ourselves with technology. We imagine that modern entertainment represents progress, sophistication, improvement. In many ways it does. And yet, the function remains remarkably similar. We still use entertainment to interrupt thought. We still reach for noise to avoid silence. We still seek moments where identity loosens and the weight of routine lifts just enough to allow us to continue. The difference is scale, not purpose. Victorian people had fewer options but clearer intentions. They did not expect entertainment to improve them. They expected it to hold them together, and perhaps that expectation was more realistic. There is a temptation to romanticize this, to frame it as communal warmth lost to individual screens. But that would be dishonest. Victorian entertainment was not kinder, it was not gentler, it was not morally superior. It was simply necessary, a pressure valve rather than a pleasure device. And the fact that it worked at all under those conditions is less a testament to cultural refinement than to human adaptability. people will always find ways to fill the evening. If nothing is provided, they will invent something. If something is forbidden, they will reshape it until it fits. Because the alternative, an evening spent entirely inside one's own mind after a day that has already taken everything else, is rarely sustainable. So when we say that entertainment was not a luxury for Victorian workers, what we really mean is this: it was part of the machinery of survival. Not recorded, not preserved, not designed to last, just loud enough, just distracting enough, just communal enough to make tomorrow possible. The pub as the working class theater. A Victorian pub was never meant to be quiet, and anyone who expected silence upon entering one misunderstood its purpose entirely, because the pub was not designed as a place to think. It was designed as a place to interrupt thinking, to overwhelm it gently but persistently, until whatever followed you in from the street lost its ability to speak clearly. From the outside, many of these places looked unimpressive, sometimes barely distinguishable from the buildings pressed tightly against them, their signs faded by weather and repetition, their windows clouded by years of smoke and touch, their doors hanging slightly crooked as if even the hinges had grown tired. But this modest exterior was misleading, because what waited inside was not a room so much as a process already in motion. The Beer House Act of 1830 made this possible in a way that still feels almost reckless by modern standards, because it removed much of the bureaucracy that usually stands between an idea and its consequences, allowing anyone with modest means and a willingness to pour beer to open a public house. And the result was not refinement but abundance. Streets where pubs appeared as frequently as corners, sometimes more than one on the same stretch of road, offering not comfort, but availability, which was often enough. Stepping inside one of these establishments was less like entering a business and more like being absorbed into an atmosphere that had already decided how the evening would proceed, because sound hit first, layered voices colliding and overlapping, laughter erupting unpredictably, arguments that sounded heated but were rarely serious, all of it moving at a volume that discouraged introspection by sheer force. And then came the smell, beer of questionable freshness, tobacco, damp wool coats, bodies that had worked hard and not yet been given time to forget it, a combination that modern noses might reject. But which? Victorian patrons quickly stopped noticing, not because it improved, but because attention had better places to go. This was not a space for individual identity in the modern sense, because individuality required privacy and privacy was in short supply. Instead, the pub offered something more practical, a temporary suspension of hierarchy in which names mattered less than presence, and reputation was built through repetition rather than status. Stories circulated endlessly in these rooms, not because they were especially good, but because they were shared. The same anecdotes told night after night, gaining polish through use rather than originality, their accuracy becoming irrelevant compared to their familiarity, and familiarity carried its own comfort, especially for people whose daily lives were defined by tasks that never changed. Songs functioned much the same way, with simple melodies and lyrics that survived precisely because they could be remembered without effort, sung collectively rather than performed individually, and the act of singing together mattered more than the quality of sound produced, because collective noise created a sense of momentum that solitary voices could not. Games occupied the spaces between conversation and music, often simple, often improvised, requiring little equipment and even less explanation, but capable of absorbing complete attention. And this was crucial, because these games did not ask participants who they were outside the room. They asked only whether they could aim, throw, roll, or react, offering a rare environment where skill temporarily replaced circumstance. It is easy to underestimate how powerful this substitution was, because for many Victorian workers, life offered very few opportunities to succeed at anything that felt personal. Wages did not reflect effort, advancement was unpredictable at best, and recognition was scarce. But in the pub, victory was immediate and visible, acknowledged by cheers that were sincere precisely because nothing else depended on them. Money was always involved to some degree, not in life-changing amounts, but enough to add tension, enough to make outcomes matter without making failure catastrophic. And this delicate balance was part of the appeal, because risk without ruin is one of the most reliable engines of engagement humans have ever discovered. There is something quietly ironic in how critics of the time described pubs as corrupting influences, because from the perspective of those who relied on them, pubs functioned less as sources of moral decay and more as informal support networks, places where information circulated, where jobs were mentioned, where absences were noticed, and where a person could disappear for an evening without vanishing entirely. The pub did not solve problems, but it redistributed attention, and that redistribution was often enough to prevent problems from hardening into despair. Modern observers sometimes struggle with this idea, because we are accustomed to entertainment that promises improvement, enrichment, or optimization. But Victorian pub culture promised none of these things. It offered instead a temporary rearrangement of reality, where noise replaced thought, repetition replaced novelty, and community replaced introspection. And these substitutions were not accidental, they were adaptive. There was also humor, often rough, occasionally clever, frequently recycled, humor that depended less on surprise than on recognition, because laughing at something familiar is easier than laughing at something new when energy is limited, and energy, after a long working day, was always limited. If this sounds exhausting rather than relaxing, that is because relaxation was not the goal. Release was, and release does not require comfort, it requires permission. Permission to be loud, to be wrong, to be temporarily unconcerned with how one appears from the outside. In that sense, the Victorian pub was a theater in the oldest meaning of the word, not a place to watch others perform, but a place where the act of gathering itself became the performance, where every voice contributed to a collective effect that no individual could produce alone. And perhaps that is why these spaces multiplied so quickly once they were allowed to exist, because they answered a need that had always been present but rarely acknowledged, the need for somewhere to go at the end of the day, where existence felt less solitary, less measured, less quietly oppressive. The pub did not ask who you were during daylight hours, it asked only whether you were there now, and for many Victorian workers, that question was not trivial at all, because being present, being seen, being heard even briefly, was often the closest thing to recognition they would experience all week. Skittles looked unimpressive even by Victorian standards, which is saying something, because it consisted of little more than a narrow wooden alley, 9 pins arranged with quiet patience at one end, and a heavy ball that had been touched by more hands than anyone could count. And yet this modest setup carried a weight far beyond its materials, because for working people, Skittles was not merely a game, it was a rare experiment in fairness conducted under conditions where fairness was otherwise absent. The rules were simple enough to be explained in a single breath. Roll the ball, knock down the pins, count what falls. But the simplicity was deceptive because mastery did not come from strength alone, and certainly not from money or status. It came from attention, from learning, the slight tilt of the wooden floor, from noticing how the ball responded when released a fraction of a second earlier or later, and from understanding imperfections that only revealed themselves after repetition, and repetition conveniently was something Victorian workers already knew intimately. This was the quiet irony of the game. The same discipline that exhausted them during the day became an advantage at night. Only here, it finally paid off in something immediate and visible. In most areas of Victorian life, effort disappeared into systems too large to acknowledge it, but in Skittles, effort produced results that could not be denied. A pin either fell or it did not, and everyone in the room could see which it was. This clarity mattered more than modern observers often realize, because ambiguity was the default condition of working life. Wages did not always correspond to labor, praise did not reliably follow competence, and advancement was governed by forces that rarely explained themselves. But in front of the Skittles alley, causality briefly behaved itself. When a worker stepped forward to roll, the room adjusted its attention, conversation softened, bodies shifted, and for a few seconds the usual hierarchy of the pub reorganized itself around a single action, which was remarkable precisely because it was temporary and voluntary. Nobody was required to watch, but everyone did, because watching created the possibility of surprise, and surprise was a scarce resource in a life defined by predictability. The ball rolled with a low, steady sound, not dramatic, not fast, just deliberate, and when it struck the pins, the resulting crash was more than noise. It was confirmation, proof that something had happened, that an action had reached its conclusion without interference. Cheers followed, not because the outcome changed anything substantial, but because recognition itself was valuable, especially when it arrived without paperwork, without permission, and without conditions attached. For a moment, the person who rolled well was not evaluated as a worker, a tenant, or a problem to be managed, but as a participant who had done something competently in front of witnesses, which was a rare combination. There is something unsettling about how powerful this felt, because it reveals how little acknowledgement most people received elsewhere. And it also explains why such games inspired seriousness that could appear absurd to outsiders, because when opportunities to matter are limited, even small ones are protected fiercely. Arguments over rules were common, not because the stakes were high, but because the space itself mattered. The game represented one of the few environments where outcomes felt earned rather than assigned, and protecting that perception was essential. Money often changed hands in modest amounts, enough to sharpen focus without transforming loss into catastrophe, and this balance was crucial, because it allowed competition without permanent damage, risk without long-term consequence, which made participation sustainable over time. It is tempting to laugh at the intensity with which grown adults treated a wooden game in a smoky room, but that laughter usually comes from a position of abundance, where validation arrives frequently enough to be taken for granted, and where games are chosen for amusement rather than necessity. For Victorian workers, Skittles was not an escape from reality. It was a version of reality that briefly behaved according to comprehensible rules. Skill mattered here in a way it did not elsewhere, and the skill was learnable, transferable, and demonstrable, which made improvement visible and rewarding. This is also why spectators mattered as much as players, because without witnesses, victory loses its social function, and social function was the entire point. Being seen succeeding, even in something small, recalibrated a person's internal accounting. It did not change wages or working conditions, but it adjusted how one carried those realities afterward. The applause was not polite, it was loud, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes ironic, but it was real enough to register. And in that moment, the worker at the end of the alley was not being measured against impossible standards. He was being measured against the pins in front of him, and he had met them. When all 9 fell, there was a brief suspension of the outside world, a gap where time felt reorganized, and in that gap, the player was no longer merely enduring, he was acting and being acknowledged for it. This is the part that modern entertainment often misunderstands, because it assumes that spectacle is about observation. But in environments like these, spectacle was about participation. Even if participation took the form of collective attention rather than individual action. Skittles worked because it allowed ordinary people to experience a form of consequence that felt just, immediate, and contained, and this combination is rare enough that humans instinctively protect it when they find it. The game did not promise improvement, enlightenment, or escape. It promised something far more modest and far more reliable, a few minutes during which effort translated cleanly into outcome, witnessed by others who understood exactly why that mattered. When the moment ended, when the pins were reset and the next player stepped forward, the system resumed its normal operations, but something had shifted, if only slightly, because for a short while, someone had been more than what the day allowed him to be, and that knowledge lingered quietly, making the rest of the evening, and sometimes even the next morning, a little easier to endure. Free and easy. When the audience is part of the stage. What Victorians called a free and easy would be almost unrecognizable to a modern audience trained to expect lighting cues, printed programs, and performers who have been carefully filtered through layers of selection, rehearsal, and branding, because a free and easy was not an event constructed in advance so much as a situation that emerged once enough people agreed to stay in the same room, long enough for something to happen. There was no proper stage in the architectural sense, no raised platform designed to separate performer from observer, only a few wooden crates stacked together, sometimes unevenly, sometimes wobbling just enough to remind everyone that gravity had not signed any contracts guaranteeing stability. There were no tickets, because tickets implied planning, and planning implied an expectation of quality, which would have been an unreasonable demand given the circumstances. There was no formal program because programs assume order, and order was the first thing to dissolve once the evening reached a certain volume. Anyone could perform, which was not an invitation so much as a dare, and the absence of barriers mattered more than the presence of talent, because talent was optional, but willingness was not. You did not need a good voice, you needed a voice that could survive attention, and those are very different qualifications. Singing badly was not a problem, because accuracy was not the currency here. Commitment was, and a performer who sang with confidence but little skill would often fare better than one who sang well but cautiously, because caution reads as uncertainty, and uncertainty invites interruption. Telling a story awkwardly was also acceptable, provided the storyteller committed fully to the attempt, because the audience did not expect polish. They expected sincerity, or at least the convincing appearance of it. The audience, meanwhile, did not sit quietly and observe as if watching something fragile that might break under scrutiny, because silence was not respect in this context. Silence was absence, and absence was indistinguishable from disinterest. Instead, audiences spoke back constantly, shouting encouragement, offering unsolicited advice, mocking weak moments, and amplifying strong ones, not out of cruelty, though it could sound like that to outsiders, but out of participation, because to attend a free and easy without contributing noise was to misunderstand the entire point. This was not consumption. There was nothing to consume, no finished product to absorb passively. This was collaboration disguised as chaos, a collective experiment in seeing what could be generated when attention moved freely rather than being managed. The audience decided who stayed and who left, not through formal votes or polite applause, but through a shifting tide of sound, cheers rising for those who held interest, jeers accumulating for those who lost it. And this process was often brutal, but it was also transparent because outcomes were immediate and unambiguous, and no one was confused about why a performer had been rejected. In a world where rejection often arrived without explanation, this clarity carried a strange appeal. There is something unsettling about how comfortable people became with this arrangement, because it reveals how accustomed they were to evaluation, to being measured and judged daily by systems that offered no feedback and little mercy, and the free and easy, for all its roughness, at least returned judgment to a human scale. If you failed here, you failed loudly, quickly, and publicly, but you also failed in a space where failure did not follow you home or attach itself permanently to your identity. Tomorrow you could try again or choose not to, and either decision would be forgotten by morning. Success worked the same way, brief, intense, and transient. Cheers that lasted only as long as the performance, recognition that evaporated once someone else stepped onto the crates. This impermanence was not a flaw, it was a feature, because it prevented success from becoming obligation and failure from becoming destiny. Modern entertainment often promises permanence, recordings, replays, metrics that follow performers indefinitely, but the free and easy offered none of that. It existed entirely in the present tense, and once the room emptied, it was gone, leaving behind only vague impressions and retold fragments that grew less reliable with each repetition. Humor thrived in this environment precisely because it did not need to be refined. Jokes landed or they did not, and if they failed, the room moved on without apology, because apology would have implied seriousness. And seriousness was reserved for daylight hours. There was a lightness to this cruelty, a sense that mockery was less about dominance than about energy, a way of keeping the room alive and responsive, because a quiet audience would have been the true failure, signaling that the collective experiment had stalled. Performers learned quickly that the audience was not an obstacle to be overcome, but a force to be directed, and those who succeeded did so by acknowledging the room rather than ignoring it, incorporating interruptions, responding to heckles, adjusting pacing in real time, skills that could not be taught formally, but were learned through exposure and repetition. In this way, free and easy nights functioned as informal training grounds for presence, teaching ordinary people how to hold attention under pressure, how to recover from mistakes without collapsing, how to read a group and adjust accordingly, competencies that were rarely rewarded elsewhere in their lives, but proved invaluable here. There is an irony in how democratic this space was, because while anyone could attempt to perform, not everyone would be allowed to finish, and this selective openness mirrored the broader contradictions of Victorian society, where access was theoretically available, but success remained contingent and uneven. Yet the difference lay in agency, because here the terms were visible and participation was voluntary. And this voluntary aspect changed the emotional equation entirely. People were not forced onto the crates. They stepped up because they wanted something from the moment: attention, validation, disruption, or simply the experience of being heard. And wanting something openly was already a departure from a daily life structured around obligation rather than desire. The audience, too, wanted something, not excellence, but involvement, the feeling that the evening was unfolding because they were present rather than despite it. This mutual dependency created a fragile equilibrium, one that could tip into hostility or hilarity with equal ease, and navigating that instability was part of the appeal. It is tempting to dismiss free and easy nights as crude predecessors to modern open mic events, but that comparison misses the deeper function they served, because modern open mics exist alongside countless alternatives, whereas free and easy nights existed in an environment where entertainment options were limited and the cost of boredom was high. When nothing else was scheduled, these gatherings became the evening by default, absorbing whoever wandered in, regardless of intention, turning accidental attendance into participation by sheer proximity. There was also a quiet resistance embedded in this format, not overt or ideological, but practical, because it disrupted the usual separation between performer and audience that reinforced social hierarchies. And while this disruption did not challenge the broader system, it created temporary zones where status blurred and roles became negotiable. For a few hours, the person who spoke well or sang boldly mattered more than the person who owned property or managed others. And while this inversion did not last, its existence alone was enough to recalibrate how people understood themselves in relation to one another. The unsettling part is how effective this was with so little infrastructure. No marketing, no amplification beyond the human voice, no promise of longevity. And yet these nights drew people reliably because they satisfied a need that did not require refinement to recognize itself. They provided immediacy in a world that often felt distant, response in a system that rarely replied, and participation in a society that usually assigned roles without consultation. When the night ended and the crates were unstacked, nothing tangible remained, but something intangible had been processed, energy released, tension redistributed, identity loosened just enough to prevent fracture. This is why free and easy nights mattered, not because they produced art worth preserving, but because they produced moments that allowed people to carry on, and in a life shaped by endurance rather than aspiration. That was more than enough. Penny GAFF, Theatre of Child Workers. For children who worked in Victorian factories, the penny gaff was not a harmless diversion or a charming curiosity. It was often the only doorway available into anything resembling imagination, because imagination requires space, and space was precisely what industrial childhood did not provide. A single penny was enough to enter, a coin small enough to be earned, borrowed, or quietly withheld from something else. And that mattered, because affordability determined access more than any moral consideration ever did. The room itself was rarely impressive, often converted from a former shop, a warehouse, or the back of a public house, and it carried the lingering memory of whatever it had been before. Meat, damp wood, old smoke, sweat, all layered together into a smell that announced immediately that cleanliness was not the priority here. The stage, if it could be called that, was unstable, assembled from boards and crates that shifted under weight, reminding both actors and audience that nothing about the structure was permanent or guaranteed. And yet this instability did not undermine the experience. It enhanced it, because everything about the penny gaff existed on the edge of collapse, including the lives of the children watching. What unfolded on that fragile platform was not subtle storytelling, it was exaggeration elevated to principle. Thieves who slipped free from chains with impossible ease. Guards who were loud, foolish, and predictably outwitted. Heroes whose cleverness mattered more than their background. And villains whose authority dissolved the moment it was laughed at. These stories were not chosen at random. They were selected because they resonated with an audience that understood power as something imposed rather than earned, and resistance as something imagined rather than permitted. The children watching were not passive observers. They were loud, reactive, and unapologetically involved, shouting warnings to characters who could not hear them, cheering escapes they knew were impossible, booing figures of authority with an enthusiasm that bordered on relief, because this was one of the few spaces where disobedience carried no immediate consequence. Outside the penny gaff, rules were enforced without explanation and mistakes were costly, but inside, rules existed only to be broken repeatedly, and breaking them was framed not as failure but as entertainment. There is a quiet irony in how reformers of the time described penny gaffs as corrupting influences, because from the perspective of the children who attended them, these performances did not introduce rebellion, they acknowledged it, giving shape to feelings that already existed but had nowhere else to go. A child who spent 12 hours feeding machines or running errands through streets that did not belong to him did not need to be taught that authority could be unfair. He already knew. What the penny gaff offered was the rare pleasure of seeing that unfairness rendered ridiculous. Laughter played a crucial role here. Not the polite laughter of approval, but loud, uncontrolled laughter that disrupted the room and briefly inverted the power dynamic between stage and seats, because laughter placed the audience in control, even if only for the duration of the joke. The performances themselves were rarely polished, lines were forgotten, props failed, timing slipped, and none of this mattered, because precision was not the currency being exchanged. Recognition was recognition of shared frustration, shared hope, shared impatience with a world that demanded obedience without offering explanation. Penny gaff heroes were rarely admirable in a moral sense. They were clever rather than virtuous, opportunistic rather than noble, and this distinction mattered because it aligned more closely with the realities of survival that working children understood. Survival did not reward goodness consistently, but it did reward alertness and adaptability. Authority figures, by contrast, were depicted as rigid and predictable, qualities that made them easy targets for mockery, and this mockery functioned as a safety valve, allowing children to release feelings they were otherwise expected to suppress indefinitely. The adult world found this threatening not because it led to immediate disorder, but because it revealed something uncomfortable, that children were already aware of injustice and did not accept it as naturally as adults pretended to. Penny gaffs did not create dissent. They provided it with costumes and dialogue. There is something deeply unsettling about how well these stories worked with such minimal resources, a few actors, borrowed costumes, exaggerated gestures, and yet the emotional impact was significant because the audience was primed, ready to believe, not because the illusion was convincing, but because belief itself was an act of defiance, a choice to invest in a version of the world where the small could outwit the large. This belief did not persist beyond the evening. The children returned to work the next morning knowing exactly where they stood, but the memory of those performances lingered quietly, offering a mental alternative to the roles they were expected to inhabit. Penny gaffs also blurred the boundary between reality and performance in ways that were unsettling to outsiders. Children shouted advice to actors, corrected plot points, and treated the stage as an extension of their own experience rather than a separate realm. And this collapse of distance mattered because it reinforced the idea that stories were not owned by authorities. They were shared and reshaped by those who needed them. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to interpret penny gaff narratives as early forms of social commentary, but this risks overstating their intentionality. These shows were not carefully constructed critiques. They were practical responses to an audience that demanded certain outcomes repeatedly, escapes rather than punishments, reversals rather than resolutions, laughter rather than moral lessons. The absence of moralizing was not an oversight, it was a necessity, because moral lessons belonged to institutions that already held power, and penny gaffs survived precisely because they avoided aligning themselves with those institutions. The humor was often crude, sometimes chaotic, occasionally incoherent, but it was accessible, and accessibility mattered more than coherence in a room full of tired children seeking interruption rather than instruction. The penny gaff did not promise improvement, education, or redemption. It promised a brief suspension of inevitability, and that promise was enough to draw children back, night after night, whenever they could spare the coin. There is a sadness embedded in this, not because the children were naive, but because the only place they could imagine victory was on a collapsing stage, in a room that smelled of old labor. And yet there is also resilience here, because imagination persisted even when conditions did not support it, adapting to available materials, shrinking to fit the spaces it was allowed to occupy. Penny gaffs did not last forever. Authorities cracked down, tastes shifted, other forms of entertainment emerged. But for a crucial period, they filled a gap that nothing else addressed, offering working children a way to see themselves not as background figures in someone else's story, but as an audience whose reactions mattered. In a world that rarely listened to them, that alone was powerful. And perhaps that is why these crude, unstable, easily dismissed theaters left such a lasting impression on those who passed through them. Not because they changed lives dramatically, but because they reminded children, briefly and imperfectly, that power could be laughed at, even if only in the dark, for the price of a penny. Street entertainment. Free, chaotic, and vibrant. Victorian street entertainment did not wait behind doors or require permission to be encountered. It simply existed in the open, woven into the movement of the city itself. appearing wherever people slowed down long enough to notice that something unusual was happening nearby. And this accessibility was not accidental but essential, because the street was the only venue that could not exclude anyone by design. There were no tickets because there were no walls, no ushers because there were no seats, no formal beginning because crowds assembled gradually, one curious pause at a time, until a loose circle formed and something resembling an audience emerged out of nothing more than shared attention. Sword swallowers leaned backward beneath flickering gaslight, performing acts that looked impossible, even to those who suspected a trick, because the point was not understanding how it worked. The point was watching something that seemed to defy the ordinary rules governing bodies and consequences, if only briefly. Barrel organ players turned their handles patiently, releasing melodies that repeated themselves endlessly without complaint. Music designed not to impress but to persist, accompanied sometimes by a monkey dressed in a small red jacket that bowed, danced, and collected coins with unsettling professionalism, an arrangement that struck adults as absurd and children as irresistible, because animals performing human gestures have always unsettled social hierarchies in ways people struggle to articulate. Punch and Judy shows unfolded inside small, battered booths, patched together with fabric and stubbornness, their puppets engaging in exaggerated violence that would have horrified reformers and delighted children precisely because it transformed authority into something that could be hit, mocked, and defeated repeatedly without lasting consequence. This kind of spectacle did not require moral justification. It required only visibility, because street entertainment thrived on interruption rather than invitation. It caught people mid-errand, mid-thought, mid-fatigue, and redirected their attention without asking permission. Payment was optional, which changed everything, because optional payment removed the tension of obligation, allowing enjoyment without guilt and contribution without pressure. And this flexibility mattered deeply in a society where money determined access to nearly everything else. If you had a coin, you dropped it into a hat or a cup. If you did not, you stayed anyway, because no one stopped you and no one asked questions. And this unspoken agreement created a rare environment where presence did not need to be justified by purchasing power. For the poorest spectators, this mattered more than the performance itself, because exclusion was the default condition of their lives, and inclusion, even temporary and informal, carried its own quiet dignity. The street did not promise comfort. Performances were. They were subject to weather, noise, interruption, and competition from other attractions. And yet this instability was part of the appeal, because it mirrored the unpredictability of everyday life while offering outcomes that felt less punitive. A performer failed, the crowd drifted away, no records were kept, no reputations permanently damaged, which made experimentation possible in a way more formal venues could not support. Children gathered closest, drawn by movement, color, and noise, their reactions immediate and unfiltered, laughter erupting without moderation, while adults hovered at the edges, pretending not to care while staying just long enough to absorb the atmosphere, because even those who considered themselves above such amusements still responded to the same human cues. Street entertainment created temporary communities that dissolved as quickly as they formed, groups bound not by identity but by momentary attention. And this fluidity was crucial, because it allowed people to participate without commitment, to enjoy without investing more than a few minutes or a few pennies. There was also a quiet economy at work here, not only for performers who depended on coins, but for spectators who depended on distraction, because the street offered a form of entertainment that adjusted itself to available resources, scaling up or down depending on crowd size, energy, and interest, without ever demanding more than could be given. Reformers criticized these spectacles as chaotic and improper, but their criticism often missed the point, because chaos was not a flaw in this context. It was the feature that made street entertainment accessible, adaptable, and resilient. Order required enforcement, and enforcement always excluded someone, whereas chaos allowed everyone to find a place at the edge, if not the center. There is something quietly subversive about how street entertainment refused to separate audience from environment. Performances happened amid carts, footsteps, arguments, and everyday noise, collapsing the boundary between art and life until the two became indistinguishable. This mattered because it suggested that joy did not require special preparation or controlled conditions. It could appear in the middle of routine, interrupting it briefly without demanding transformation. The humor was often crude, visual, repetitive, designed to be understood instantly without explanation, because explanation assumes attention spans that exhaustion does not support, and the simplicity ensured that even those passing by for only a moment could participate fully. Punch striking Judy with a stick did not require context. The reaction was immediate, and while modern sensibilities recoil from the content, the structure reveals something enduring. Children laughed not because violence was celebrated, but because authority was rendered ridiculous, and ridicule is one of the few tools available to those without power. The fact that adults tolerated this, even when they disapproved, speaks to an unspoken recognition that children needed somewhere to release what they were required to suppress elsewhere. Street entertainment did not replace other forms of amusement. It complemented them, filling gaps between work and rest, between destinations, between obligations, and this in-between quality made it uniquely resilient. Because it did not compete directly with established institutions, it existed alongside them, parasitic in the most adaptive sense. When a performance ended, the street resumed its ordinary rhythm. Carts rolled on, people dispersed, and nothing tangible remained, but the interruption lingered, a small disruption in the mental ledger of the day that made the next hour feel lighter. In a society that structured life rigidly by class and income, the street offered a rare leveling mechanism, not through ideology or reform, but through proximity. Everyone stood on the same pavement, watched the same act, laughed at the same moment, and for a few minutes, difference mattered less than attention. Victorian street entertainment did not pretend to solve inequality. It did something far more modest and far more effective. It refused to acknowledge it as a barrier to enjoyment. And in doing so, it created fleeting moments where the city felt shared rather than divided. That this sharing was temporary did not diminish its value, because endurance is built from temporary relief, repeated often enough to sustain momentum. And street entertainment provided exactly that: relief without commitment, joy without cost, presence without permission, proving that in Victorian England, entertainment did not belong to the wealthy. It belonged to whoever happened to be standing close enough to watch. Music Hall, the church of the crowd. When the music hall arrived, it did not announce itself as a cultural revolution, because revolutions require intention and manifestos, and the music hall was far too busy selling tickets, pouring drinks, and keeping the noise from spilling into the street to worry about ideological clarity. And yet, quietly and persistently, it altered the emotional architecture of the city in ways that were difficult to reverse. Unlike the pub, which absorbed people in small numbers, or the street, which scattered attention as easily as it gathered it, the music hall concentrated bodies, hundreds of them, into a single enclosed space designed specifically for shared experience, and that concentration changed the rules. Here, the crowd did not merely witness entertainment, it generated it, because sound behaved differently when amplified by numbers rather than by walls, and laughter, once it reached a certain density, stopped belonging to any individual and became an atmosphere that pulled everyone else into alignment. This was not a quiet alignment. It was loud, uneven, occasionally unruly, and deeply physical, because voices strained together, hands clapped in imperfect unison, and feet stamped, not out of anger, but out of rhythm, a collective movement that required no coordination beyond willingness. Workers sat beside clerks, shop assistants beside junior officials, and this proximity mattered not because it erased class distinctions permanently, which it did not, but because it suspended them temporarily in a way that few other spaces allowed. And suspension, even brief, can feel transformative when daily life is rigidly stratified. Women attended in numbers large enough to be noticed, not as chaperoned observers, but as participants, laughing loudly, responding openly, and occasionally voicing opinions that would have been considered inappropriate elsewhere. And the music hall absorbed this without comment, because once the crowd reached a certain volume, decorum lost its enforcement mechanisms. Songs functioned as the primary connective tissue of the evening, and these were not complex compositions demanding careful listening. They were deliberately simple, repetitive, and structured around choruses designed to be learned quickly, because the goal was not admiration but participation. Lyrics teased the wealthy with affectionate mockery, exaggerated the absurdities of status, and highlighted social contradictions without naming them directly, because naming them would have required resolution, and resolution was not on offer. Instead, humor carried the weight, allowing uncomfortable observations to pass under the cover of laughter, a strategy that made critique palatable without making it dangerous. Sexual innuendo appeared frequently, but always obliquely, wrapped in double meanings that could be enjoyed innocently or knowingly, depending on the listener's inclination, which gave performers plausible deniability and audiences shared complicity, a quiet agreement that everyone understood more than they admitted. This ambiguity was not accidental. It was carefully cultivated because it allowed the music hall to push boundaries without crossing lines that would trigger intervention, maintaining a balance that kept the doors open and the crowd returning. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to interpret these performances as proto-political statements. But this misreads their function because the music hall did not seek to change structures. It sought to make them tolerable, offering pressure release rather than confrontation. This distinction matters because pressure release can be mistaken for complacency, when in fact it often serves as a survival mechanism, allowing systems to persist by giving those within them moments of relief that prevent fracture. The humor was sharp but not surgical. Its aim was not to excise injustice, but to acknowledge it openly in a space where acknowledgement itself felt rare. Performers learned to read rooms with remarkable precision, adjusting tempo, emphasis, and tone in response to subtle shifts in audience energy. Because a crowd of hundreds is not a monolith, it is a fluid organism that responds unpredictably to stimulus, and managing that organism required sensitivity rather than authority. Those who succeeded did so not by dominating the audience, but by aligning with it, positioning themselves as conduits rather than focal points. And this relational dynamic distinguished music hall performance from more formal theatrical traditions. The presence of alcohol further softened boundaries, lowering inhibitions without eliminating awareness, creating an environment where reactions were intensified but not entirely uncontrolled. A delicate balance that made evenings feel expansive without tipping into chaos. There is something quietly ironic about how moral critics of the era described music halls as vulgar and dangerous, because what frightened them was not excess, but accessibility, the idea that large numbers of ordinary people could gather, react together, and find common emotional ground outside sanctioned institutions. The music hall did not teach rebellion, but it did normalize collective response, and normalization can be unsettling to those invested in managing behavior through isolation rather than congregation. The architecture itself reinforced this effect. Tables arranged to encourage conversation, sight lines designed to keep performers visible without elevating them beyond reach, lighting that illuminated faces as much as the stage, ensuring that audience members remained aware of one another rather than retreating into anonymity. This mutual visibility mattered because it transformed entertainment into a shared act rather than a one-directional transmission, making every reaction part of the performance, whether intended or not. In this environment, laughter was contagious, not because jokes were universally excellent, but because laughter itself became a signal of belonging, a way to demonstrate alignment with the collective mood, and choosing not to laugh required more effort than joining in. Music halls also blurred distinctions between seriousness and frivolity, because beneath the humor lay recognitions that were deeply felt, frustrations acknowledged without being resolved, desires expressed without being acted upon, injustices named without being challenged directly, and this layering allowed people to engage with difficult material without feeling overwhelmed by it. The unsettling aspect of this arrangement is how effective it was, because it suggests that systems do not always require suppression to maintain stability. Sometimes they require spaces where pressure can be released safely, where critique can be aired harmlessly, and where dissatisfaction can be transformed into noise rather than action. Yet to dismiss music halls as mere safety valves would be incomplete, because within those noisy rooms, people experienced something genuinely rare: collective presence unmediated by hierarchy, a sense that their reactions mattered simply because they were shared. This experience did not vanish when the evening ended. It lingered as memory, as expectation, as a reference point against which quieter nights felt thinner by comparison. People returned, not because the content was always new, but because the feeling was reliable, the feeling of being part of something larger than oneself, without surrendering individuality entirely. In this sense, the music hall functioned less like a theater and more like a secular cathedral of sound, not sacred in belief but ritualistic in structure, drawing crowds at predictable intervals, offering familiar patterns of participation, and leaving attendees altered not by doctrine but by shared emotion. When the songs ended and the crowd dispersed into the night, nothing tangible remained. No artifacts, no records, only voices hoarse from singing and bodies tired from standing. but something essential had been processed, energy redistributed, tensions softened, and that processing was what allowed people to return to their routines with a little less weight pressing inward. The music hall did not promise change, and that is precisely why it endured, because change would have required responsibility, and responsibility was already abundant. What people needed was release, and the music hall delivered it efficiently, repeatedly, and with just enough humor to make the pressure feel lighter, proving that sometimes survival does not depend on revolution, but on having somewhere loud enough to breathe together. The middle class controlled entertainment. Middle-class Victorian entertainment preferred to describe itself as respectable rather than enjoyable because respectability was the currency that allowed comfort to exist without apology, and so the spaces where it unfolded were carefully chosen and meticulously arranged: drawing rooms instead of streets, upholstered chairs instead of benches, polished pianos instead of barrel organs, tea instead of beer. And yet beneath this controlled surface, the underlying need was identical to that of every other class: the need to loosen, to interrupt routine, and to remember that existence extended beyond obligation. These evenings began politely, often with measured conversation that circled safe topics without landing anywhere dangerous, voices moderated, posture maintained, laughter restrained to appropriate intervals, as if enjoyment itself required supervision. And for a time this restraint held because middle-class identity depended heavily on performance, on demonstrating that one belonged to a category defined as much by behavior as by income. Games like charades were particularly well suited to this environment because they allowed play while preserving the illusion of decorum, gestures exaggerated but not uncontrolled, laughter permitted but contained, competition softened by humor rather than sharpened by stakes. And yet, even within these gentle boundaries, something else began to happen once the evening progressed. As songs were sung around the piano, not professionally but enthusiastically, voices blending unevenly, mistakes ignored, rhythms improvised, the careful separation between public self and private desire began to thin because singing together requires a kind of surrender, a willingness to be heard imperfectly, and imperfection is precisely what middle-class respectability worked hardest to conceal. Tea cooled, conversations loosened, jokes grew bolder, and laughter occasionally escaped its designated role as polite response and became genuine, uncontrolled, the kind that interrupts itself and draws attention rather than avoiding it. This was not rebellion, and it did not pretend to be, because the middle class had too much invested in stability to romanticize disruption, but it was release nonetheless. Release achieved not by breaking rules outright, but by bending them just far enough to allow breath. The irony is that this controlled form of entertainment often required more effort than the chaotic alternatives enjoyed elsewhere, because maintaining an appearance of ease while carefully regulating behavior is labor of its own kind. Emotional labor that demanded constant awareness of how one was perceived by others who were doing the same. In these rooms, everyone watched everyone else subtly, not out of suspicion, but out of shared understanding that belonging was conditional and that conditions could change. Yet this mutual observation also created opportunities for recognition, moments when someone sang particularly well, guessed cleverly in a game, or told a story with unexpected wit, earning admiration that felt earned rather than inherited. And these moments mattered because the middle class existed in a state of perpetual comparison, upward toward those with greater wealth and downward toward those whose proximity threatened their own status. Entertainment offered a temporary reprieve from this vertical anxiety, because within the confines of the drawing room, hierarchy flattened slightly, not enough to disappear, but enough to become negotiable, allowing people to be appreciated for qualities that were not immediately convertible into social capital. Women in particular found these spaces significant because while their public roles were constrained, the drawing room allowed them to direct conversation, choose music, set tone, and influence atmosphere in ways that were subtle but powerful, exercising authority without naming it, which was often the only form of authority available. Humor here was gentler than in pubs or streets, but it was not absent, often relying on irony, understatement, and shared references that reinforced group identity while still providing relief, laughter that acknowledged tension without exposing it fully. The unsettling aspect of these gatherings lies in how carefully calibrated they were, how enjoyment was permitted only within boundaries that ensured it did not threaten the structure supporting it. And yet, even within these boundaries, something genuine occurred, because humans are remarkably adept at finding authenticity in constrained spaces. When a group sang together even a simple song, they synchronized breath, rhythm, and attention, and this synchronization produced a sense of connection that did not depend on ideology or ambition, only on presence, and presence was the one thing everyone in the room could offer equally. These evenings ended predictably at respectable hours, guests departing with polite farewells, coats retrieved, composure restored, but the effect lingered quietly, a subtle recalibration of identity that made the next day feel slightly less rigid. It would be easy to dismiss middle-class entertainment as bland or performative compared to the rawness of other forms, but this misses its function, because for people whose lives were structured around maintaining appearances, the drawing room provided a sanctioned space where those appearances could soften without collapsing. This softening was not trivial. It was essential, because without it, the strain of constant self-regulation would have become unsustainable. Entertainment reminded them that they were not only clerks, merchants, spouses, or hosts, but people capable of spontaneous reaction, shared enjoyment, and unguarded laughter, even if only briefly. The piano did not liberate them, charades did not challenge the social order, tea did not erase inequality, but together these rituals performed a quieter task. They reintroduced humanity into lives increasingly defined by roles. In a society obsessed with classification, with placing individuals into categories that determined expectation and opportunity, these evenings allowed people to step slightly outside their assigned boxes without attracting attention, to experience themselves as participants rather than representatives. That this experience was controlled does not diminish its importance, because control itself was part of the bargain, a way to ensure that release did not become risk. And so, in these carefully arranged rooms, amid polite laughter and measured play, the middle class found its own version of survival, not through noise or spectacle, but through moments of shared presence that loosened the grip of performance just enough to remind them that beneath the roles they inhabited so diligently, there were still people capable of singing off-key, laughing too loudly, and enjoying it. Elite entertainment, ritualizing joy. The entertainment of the Victorian upper class liked to present itself as pleasure refined into tradition, joy elevated into ceremony, leisure arranged so carefully that it could pass for duty, because in a world where privilege needed justification, enjoyment was safest when disguised as obligation. And so fox hunts began at dawn with punctuality that suggested moral seriousness rather than amusement. Dinners stretched into elaborate productions with fixed seating, regulated conversation, and courses timed with almost military precision. And gentlemen's clubs wrapped relaxation in rules so thick they resembled constitutions rather than invitations. From the outside, this world looks like abundance without friction, but inside it functioned as a loop that required constant participation, because to belong to the upper class was not simply to possess wealth, it was to perform continuity, to show up repeatedly, predictably, and visibly, affirming through attendance that one still occupied the correct position in the social constellation. A hunt was not merely a ride across open land, it was an announcement that one was present, capable, and aligned with inherited rhythms, the same fields crossed by previous generations, the same stories retold afterward with slight variations that preserved tradition while allowing individuality to appear in controlled doses. The irony, gently unsettling if you linger on it, is that these rituals were exhausting in their own way, because abundance does not eliminate repetition, it amplifies it, turning pleasure into something that must be scheduled, maintained, and witnessed. Dinner parties required preparation that rivaled the labor of any workshop, clothing selected with strategic awareness, conversation rehearsed implicitly, reactions managed so that wit appeared spontaneous but never reckless, and when the evening ended, satisfaction came less from enjoyment than from successful execution, the quiet relief of having performed one's role without error. Gentlemen's clubs offered a different variation on the same theme, spaces designed to feel timeless, insulated from the noise of the city, where comfort was standardized and predictability was the primary luxury, leather chairs worn smooth by decades of similar conversations, newspapers read by men who had already formed opinions before opening them. Games played not for stakes, but for continuity, because what mattered most was that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to feel secure. These were places where time did not advance so much as circulate. And this circulation served a purpose, because identity at this level depended on rhythm, on knowing where one was expected to be at certain hours, with certain people, performing certain gestures that confirmed stability. The upper class did not seek novelty in entertainment. Novelty implied risk, and risk threatened inheritance, so instead they sought repetition with variations so slight it could be mistaken for change. A new guest at dinner, a different route on a familiar ride, a fresh anecdote woven into an old framework. Humor existed here, but it was often self-referential and restrained. Irony aimed inward rather than outward. Jokes that acknowledged absurdity without challenging it. Laughter that reassured rather than disrupted, because even amusement was expected to demonstrate good breeding. And yet, beneath this polish, the same fundamental needs persisted. The need for shared experience, for collective attention, for moments that broke the isolation created by status, because privilege can be strangely lonely, separating individuals from the broader currents of life while trapping them in circles that are small precisely because they are exclusive. These rituals created community, but it was a community bound by obligation as much as affection, one maintained through mutual recognition rather than genuine intimacy. And this made entertainment less about escape and more about endurance, a way to mark time until the next expected gathering, the next season, the next inherited role came into focus. There is a quiet irony in how much effort was expended to make this life appear effortless, because ease itself became a performance requiring constant calibration, the correct amount of enthusiasm, the correct degree of detachment, and any deviation risked appearing either vulgar or bored, both equally dangerous. Even leisure demanded vigilance, and perhaps this is why upper-class entertainment leaned so heavily on ritual, because ritual reduces uncertainty, allowing participants to relax into predefined roles rather than improvise their own responses. When a hunt followed a familiar pattern, when a dinner unfolded according to expectation, when a club evening replicated countless previous ones, the comfort lay not in excitement, but in predictability, the assurance that tomorrow would arrive with the same structure as today. This predictability served as a reason for tomorrow to exist, not because it promised novelty, but because it promised continuation, and continuation was the deepest value of all in a system built on inheritance. Yet this very stability could feel strangely hollow, producing a kind of fatigue that was not physical but existential, a weariness born of knowing that enjoyment would always look the same, sound the same, require the same gestures, and so subtle restlessness crept in, managed rather than acknowledged, softened through routine rather than resolved. The unsettling truth is that even with every material comfort secured, joy still required structure, community, and rhythm, because without these, abundance collapses into emptiness and time becomes something to be endured rather than inhabited. Entertainment, ritualized as it was, functioned as a way to inhabit time meaningfully, to divide the year into seasons of activity and rest, to give shape to days that might otherwise blur into each other despite their luxury. In this sense, the upper class was no different from any other group except in scale and costume, because the human need to mark time, to gather, to share attention, persists, regardless of wealth. The fox hunt, the dinner, the club were not expressions of excess so much as solutions to the same problem everyone faced: how to make tomorrow feel worth arriving at when today already contains everything it is supposed to contain. And so, beneath the velvet, the etiquette, and the inherited ease, entertainment served the same quiet purpose it served everywhere else: to impose rhythm on existence, to transform repetition into ritual, and to convince those participating that their place in the cycle mattered, even when the cycle itself rarely changed. The intersection of all social stratifications. Across Victorian society, the differences were obvious enough to be drawn in sharp lines. Money separated houses from lodgings, space divided ballrooms from back rooms, and time itself felt unevenly distributed, stretching comfortably for some while, crushing others into narrow hours of labor. And yet when you step back far enough, these distinctions begin to blur around a shared necessity that refused to respect class boundaries. Entertainment, in every form it took, operated as a mechanism for endurance rather than escape, a way of absorbing pressure so that daily life could continue without shattering. The dock worker shouting encouragement during a pub game, the factory child leaning forward in a penny theater, the clerk laughing too loudly during a drawing room game, and the landowner riding out at dawn, all participated in variations of the same ritual, each seeking rhythm in a world that otherwise moved either too slowly or too fast. The irony is gentle but persistent, because while each class believed its version of leisure was fundamentally different, more refined, more necessary, or more deserved, the emotional outcome was remarkably similar: a temporary rebalancing of the self, a moment when effort aligned with reward and existence felt slightly less abrasive. Entertainment did not promise transformation, and that was precisely why it worked, because it did not ask people to imagine a different life, only to survive the one they had, with enough energy left to face the next day. The working poor did not attend pubs dreaming of social mobility. Children at penny gaffs did not expect authority to crumble permanently. Middle-class families did not sing together in hopes of abandoning propriety, and aristocrats did not hunt expecting novelty. And yet all of them returned to these activities with predictable regularity, because repetition created stability, and stability created tolerance. This tolerance was not enthusiasm, it was endurance dressed in habit, the quiet ability to wake up tomorrow without resentment overwhelming purpose. What makes this convergence unsettling is how little the content of entertainment mattered compared to its function, because songs, games, performances, and rituals varied widely, but their role remained consistent: to impose structure on emotional fatigue, to interrupt monotony without destroying it, and to remind participants that they were not alone in their experience of strain. Shared laughter, even when uneven, poorly timed, or deliberately restrained, produced recognition, the subtle understanding that others were carrying similar weights, even if the weights differed in material. This recognition did not require empathy in the modern sense. It did not depend on understanding another class's suffering or privilege. It simply required proximity, inattention, the knowledge that someone else was laughing at the same moment for reasons they did not need to explain. Entertainment created this proximity without demanding equality, allowing people to remain unequal while briefly synchronized. The unsettling calm of this realization lies in how effective such small adjustments can be, how little is required to keep large systems functioning when pressure is released at regular intervals. Entertainment acted as a pressure valve, not by offering escape routes, but by reinforcing the idea that continuation was possible, that life, though unevenly generous, could be endured through cycles of effort and release. This endurance was not heroic, it was practical, built from modest pleasures repeated often enough to become reliable, and reliability was more valuable than excitement in a world where uncertainty carried real consequences. Across classes, entertainment answered the same quiet question: not how to change everything, but how to keep going without collapsing into resentment or exhaustion. The dock worker returned to work, the child returned to the factory, the clerk returned to the office, and the landowner returned to obligation, each carrying with them a residue of enjoyment that did not solve their problems but softened their edges. This softening was enough, and perhaps that is the most unsettling insight of all, that survival often depends less on grand change than on carefully timed interruptions, moments of shared attention that make the continuation of ordinary life feel tolerable rather than cruel. In this sense, entertainment did not unify classes by erasing differences. It unified them by offering the same function through different forms. A reminder that beneath wealth, status, and setting, human endurance relies on rhythm, repetition, and the small reassurance that tomorrow can be faced because tonight contained something that made it bearable. Conclusion: the remaining lesson. The Victorians lived without electricity, without glowing rectangles, without endless feeds quietly deciding what they should want next, and yet they understood something that modern life often obscures beneath convenience, that entertainment is not a luxury, layered on top of existence once survival is secured, but a mechanism woven directly into the act of enduring. They did not gather to escape life, because escape was rarely available and never convincing. Instead, they gathered to make life feel inhabitable, to introduce rhythm where days threatened to dissolve into repetition, to insert moments of shared attention that broke the sense of isolation without promising transformation. Songs were sung not because they were beautiful, but because voices joined together create reassurance even when harmony is imperfect. Games were played not because they mattered, but because winning something, however small, restored the idea that effort could still produce recognition and performances unfolded, not because audiences demanded excellence, but because watching another human try, fail, succeed, or simply persist reminded everyone present that effort itself was still visible. There is something quietly unsettling about how little was required to sustain this balance. A tune everyone half knew, a story retold too many times, a game that had been played for decades, because it suggests that the human threshold for meaning is lower than we often assume, and that fulfillment does not require novelty so much as continuity. The irony, gentle and unavoidable, is that while modern entertainment promises infinite choice, infinite access, infinite personalization, it often struggles to perform the same basic function with the same reliability because abundance can dilute attention, and attention is the true currency of relief. The Victorians did not optimize entertainment. They repeated it, trusting rhythm more than innovation, and in doing so, they created dependable pauses in lives otherwise governed by obligation. When the night ended, there was no illusion that everything had changed. Work would resume, routines would reassert themselves, hierarchies would remain intact, but the body carried forward a residue of participation, a memory of being seen or hearing others respond, and this residue made continuation possible. Perhaps that is the lesson that lingers most stubbornly, that entertainment works best not when it distracts completely, but when it acknowledges reality and offers companionship within it. The pub, the theater, the drawing room, the ballroom, all emptied eventually, voices faded, lights dimmed, costumes were folded away, and the structures that hosted joy returned to silence because joy was never meant to be permanent, only renewable. And then, regardless of income or title, people returned to beds that reflected their circumstances but not their humanity, straw or linen, narrow or wide, familiar in their own way, and they closed their eyes. Sleep arrived not as an achievement, but as a shared conclusion, the one experience no class distinction could fully alter, the moment when thought loosened its grip and the body reclaimed its quiet. In that final descent into rest, the echoes of songs, laughter, and applause softened into something indistinct, not memories exactly, but sensations, reminders that the day had contained more than effort alone. This is where the Victorian understanding feels unexpectedly close, almost uncomfortably so, because the end of their evenings mirrors the end of ours, despite all intervening technology. You too lie back now, surrounded by a different kind of glow, a different kind of silence, carrying the residue of voices that were never physically present but felt nonetheless. And like them, you do not require entertainment to escape your life, only to affirm that it is still worth continuing. So the lights go out, the noise recedes, the performances end, and what remains is the most democratic ritual of all. Eyes closing, breath slowing, the day releasing its hold, and sleep arriving not as reward, but as permission to begin again tomorrow.